So I think we'll get started in just a few minutes as people are trickling in. Looks like the folks are being let in from the waiting room. So we'll wait a few minutes and get started. I'm still seeing some of the attendees go up. So we'll give it another 30 seconds to let this stabilize, and we'll get started once everyone who's in the waiting room is in. Okay.
Okay,
Okay, folks. Oh, go ahead, Bryce.
thank you. So just some quick housekeeping before we get started with the presentation. We want to welcome everyone to the BART Fare Enforcement Report. We're going to be going over the findings of the report, talking through it with you all, taking some questions. So first things first, we'll give our presentation. We'll have a Q&A session to follow. You'll see along the bottom of the Zoom bar, there's a Q&A button you can press at any point during the presentation to submit any questions you might have. And we'll also be sending a quick survey when the webinar itself ends. When you close out the Zoom, there'll be a quick pop-up for a little survey to complete. And there will also be a follow-up email that all attendees are sent that will contain the recording of this presentation and our contact information if you have any more questions. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started.
All right. Well, thank you, Bryce. And welcome everybody to our presentation on the work that has been going on for about 2 years with the BART system. I want to thank everyone on this screen, thank our many partners in the BART system, and most importantly, thank the community members that really put in a lot of work to support us, to give us the context and information we need, and to give us some feedback about the work that was accomplished. Really couldn't do it without the many people in the Bay Area that offered their perspective and often very vulnerably their experience. We go to the next slide. So as the screen says, my name is Hans Manos. I am the Vice President of our Public Safety Innovations team. That's a team here at CPE that leads our efforts to redesign public safety and led the efforts in the BART system. You're on mute, Bryce, you're on mute.
So sorry. I'm Price Nyland. I'm the Impact and Engagement Manager on the Public Safety Innovations team and the project lead for this partnership.
Hi, everyone. My name is Paula Ioannide. I'm the qualitative research methodologist for the BART project, but also representing the science team today. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you. And I'll pass it to Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Reyes, the program assistant here at PSI and on the BART project. Thank you all for joining.
We go to the next slide. So who we are. For those of you who don't know who CPE is, we were founded in 2008 by Philip Atiba Solomon and then Chief Tracy Cassie. We're a racial justice nonprofit. We work to support, protect, and empower communities, particularly Black and Brown communities, to redesign their public safety systems. We go to the next slide. Overall, CPE believes in science for justice and justice for safety. Our goal is to make policing less racist, less deadly, and less omnipresent. And we believe we can forge a path to justice by redesigning public safety systems to keep our communities safe. You can go to the next slide.
So CPE and BART have actually been in partnership since 2016, and that initial partnership culminated in a report in 2020 that essentially needed more interest and investment in root cause analysis for potential racial disparities within the BART system. So with that lens, we partnered once again to produce this report to focus really specifically and get a really holistic landscape of BART's fare enforcement practices, the impacts that it's having on public safety, how it's affecting riders, and how it's affecting BART's own operational resources. So to do this, we collaborated with Stout, which is a global finance firm, to conduct that financial analysis and also conduct a cost-benefit analysis to better understand exactly what we're facing when we look at the BART system and how they're enforcing their fares. Next slide. So to conduct this analysis, both quantitatively and qualitatively, CPE and Stout were able to use quite a bit of different data, including BART's financial and ridership data, as well as the BART Police Department's administrative data. We also used quite a bit of publicly available data under California's Racial and Identity Profiling Act, which is called RIPA. And in the qualitative sense, we conducted 14 community focus groups totaling 95 Bay Area resident riders. We also conducted 17 one-on-one interviews with riders who'd been stopped in the last 5 years for fare evasion, and 58 riders conducted or participated in rather short surveys, also who had been stopped for fare evasion within the last 5 years. Next slide, please. So as Hans touched on earlier, community engagement was also really central to this project. The community itself was really crucial in our understanding of exactly how these practices are affecting people. We wanted to make sure we were really uplifting these historically unheard voices in this research. So to do this, in addition to our qualitative work and our general engagement of the community, we also held a working group of various community stakeholders, including folks from local organizations working in the mental health space, in the social equity space, folks from public defenders' offices, transit advocates at large. And this working group was able to give us feedback on the report and its recommendations, as well as giving really valuable input on potential ways to implement some of this work. So we really want to extend a huge thank you to all of those who participated in any aspect or element of this work. We're really grateful and honored to work alongside so many wise and insightful experts within the community who were, as Hans said, very vulnerable and very giving of their time and their experiences. Next slide, please. So we kind of want to anchor this discussion first around BART's strategy for how they're using fare enforcement operations. So in publicly available materials and upon request, BART could not share a clear strategy with us for exactly what measurable and specific goals it was hoping to achieve with its current fare enforcement practices. So because of this, we did use 3 assumptions based on press materials and public statements that BART has given over the years to anchor exactly the reasoning they might be using for certain practices and strategies. So that first strategy is recovery of revenue. So this would be fare evasion is costing us money, and we need to ticket folks to ensure that we're recouping some of those losses. The second topic is around deterrence of fare evasion. So policing in a certain way will drive deterrence in future potential fare evaders. That's one reason they might be doing things the way they are. And the third reason is that public safety related question, which is to uncover violent property or weapons related crimes. And this is where we could see the effects that these practices might have on public safety. Next slide, please. So the 5 key research questions that we examined to really ground this research cover sort of those topics we were just talking about. First one, reading into that financial question, which is, what is the estimated loss in BART's revenue as a result of fare evasion? BART has often cited up to even $25 million in annual revenue loss due to fare evasion. We wanted to get a really clear sense of exactly what that figure might look like. We were never able to find a citation for how they got that figure, and we wanted to make sure it was accurate, especially in the post-pandemic changes to ridership. Second question is also related to that financial question. Does fare enforcement help recover revenue for BART? Are personnel expenditures for BART fare enforcement worth the ROI? So what exactly is BART spending? And put it back to them to say, is this sort of ratio of spending to recovery still worth it? Does that make sense for you all? Third question is that public safety topic. Does fare evasion enforcement help uncover serious public safety threats? And when we say public safety, serious public safety threats, we mean those property, weapons, or violent crime related charges. Fourth question, do BART's fare enforcement practices impact racial groups disproportionately or cause burdensome consequences to riders? This is a central question for CPE in all of its work. wanting to better understand if these racial disparities do exist, so we can make sure they're being addressed. And the fifth question is key for the qualitative and community engagement of this project. Are BART's current fare enforcement practices aligned with riders' key concerns, making sure that those typically unheard voices are being uplifted, and making sure BART is held accountable for the community it serves and what they're looking for in their public safety. We can go to the next slide.
Okay, so I'm going to dig into one of the first research questions that Price just mentioned, which is this question of how much is BART actually losing to fare evasion? Previously in public statements, BART claimed that the loss of revenue from fare evasion was estimated to be as much as $25 million. And we wanted to understand whether there was data to back that figure up. And so we partnered with Stout, which is a global financial firm that essentially does cost-benefit analyses and has a sound methodology for coming up with estimates for something like fare evasion revenue losses. And their estimate of the loss in revenue as a result of fare evasion ended up being much less than what BART had publicly stated. They estimated the fare evasion revenue loss to be somewhere between $5.7 million to $9.5 million per year, which was far below that 25 million. And obviously, some of that may also change with the installed new gates that BART has installed, the hardened gates. But this was based on 2023 data. And essentially what they did to analyze and come up with this figure was look at publicly available data that BART provides on what's called the daily stations exit data, people who kind of swipe into the gates, but then might not swipe out, right? Which is one way you can kind of come up with a figure for approximately how many riders are not paying their fares, okay? And essentially based on 2023 ridership data figures and an average fare of $3.80, this is how they came to it. Next slide. So I'll just walk you really a little bit more closely for the math nerds out there. Essentially what they estimated is that in 2023, the BART's ridership was around 45 million riders, 45.3 million riders. Of those, they estimated the lower percent of fare evasion to be at 3.2% of those riders, to the high end being 5.3%. And they estimated that in 2023, the average fare per trip was actually up from the 2017 figures, which is kind of around the time that BART had made that public statement about the loss of revenue. And they estimated that to be at $3.96 per ride. And so that's how they came to that range between 5.7 million to 9.5 million in fare evasion losses. Okay, next slide. So if they are losing this much revenue as a result of fare evasion, one question that has been inferred, again, I want to emphasize that a lot of the public statements suggested that one way to recover some of those losses in revenue was to issue citations, okay? And when you think about who issues citations on BART trains or at BART stations, fare inspection officers are those who can issue what are called civil citations or proof of payment citations. These are not criminal citations, typically around $75 to $95. And essentially what we found, Stout estimated the cost of hiring those fare inspection officers who give out these proof of payment citations is around 2.2 million per year. Okay, this is their personnel cost plus associated expenses. But what we found is that although in the years that we analyzed, which was from 2018 to 2023, the highest amount that BART had ever collected back from paid, what are called pop citations or proof of payment citations was $86,619. Okay, so on average, in those 5 years, the percentage of writers who got a citation and actually paid that POP citation was somewhere between 6% to 12%, okay, per year. So what does that mean? That means that although these fair inspection officers, which cost BARTs and our taxpayer, our taxpayer dollars, 2.2 million, they issued over 11,000 proof of payment citations, which on face value would have been about $1 million if all of them had been paid, right? But in reality, only 8% in the highest year was actually paid, which amounts to that 86,000. So what does this let us to conclude is that issuing citations is not a good method for recovering some of that lost revenue, right? Again, when you put up how much it costs to pay these fair inspection officers and how much they're actually collecting back, it's not a good for revenue recovery, okay? Next slide, please. So then what we wanted to see is, okay, if that's for civil citations, what about criminal citations? Criminal citations have a higher face value. They're typically $250 per citation, and they can only be issued by BART police or community safety officers. These are the only, for example, fair inspection officers cannot issue criminal citations. So we wanted to know, okay, approximately how much does BART spend on the sworn and non-sworn personnel that do fair enforcement and can issue these criminal citations. For 2023, Stout estimated those expenditures to be $27.2 million. This is what it costs to pay essentially that sworn and non-sworn personnel. But very important, Stout calculated that 27.2 million only relative to the percentage of time that those officers actually spend on fair enforcement. So the total figure of what they actually cost is higher, but we estimated only what they do for fair enforcement, okay? So when you look at criminal citations, we found that basically 3,586 criminal citations are issued annually. And again, it's fewer writers because you can get more than one citation per year. This represented almost 50% of all criminal citations that BART police and community safety officers issue, okay? So again, on face value, it was $896,500 of these criminal citations, okay? We could not confirm how many of these criminal citations were actually paid. And I will spare you all the details, but criminal citations for fare evasion are similar to traffic tickets. They go to court. You have to go to appear in court or you can pay it. But if you don't pay it, right, it becomes a court issue. And the way that they divvy up that $250 fee involves many, many different agencies. It's not just BART who's getting it back, right? But if we took that same 6 to 12% of that we kind of could confirm for the POP citations in terms of the average payment of these criminal citations, then we realize that criminal citations are also a very poor, minimal way of recovering revenue for BART, okay? So issuing citations is not really giving a good return on investment for BART as far as revenue recovery is concerned. Next slide, please. Okay, so now what we wanted to see is, all right, BART's not getting much in return fiscally as a result of issuing these criminal citations, right? But what is the impact on BART riders? What are the consequences downstream of getting this criminal citation? And here, Stout did an analysis that essentially took that criminal citation and considered other associated costs that an average writer who receives this criminal citation incurs if they receive one, right? So things, for example, like I'm unable to pay that criminal citation, now it goes to collections, okay? If it goes to collections, the downstream impact is it lowers my credit score. It lowers my credit score. I might not be actually able to be eligible for particular housing in the Bay Area if that landlord or even that affordable housing complex uses a credit score threshold for me to qualify to get that housing, right? It's certainly loss of time. I might have to take time off from employment to go to court to deal with that criminal citation, or even just the loss of the income and the downstream consequences that that might have for people who can't pay it, right? Or who can pay it. Now, the most dire consequence of these criminal citations is that in the BART system, if you get 3 or more of these criminal citations, it can end up in a fare evasion misdemeanor charge. Now that's much more serious because for a misdemeanor charge, you can actually be arrested, right? Once you're arrested, you could go and be booked for, let's say, 14 days, and you now have to come up with bail money. You get the point, right? The downstream consequences of these criminal citations, therefore, is an average fiscal impact of $1,654 per criminal citation issued, right, to the writer itself who receives it. Because we calculated those hidden downstream consequences within that figure, okay? Now, again, the number of writers who are receiving these criminal citations relative to the total ridership are relatively few. We have 45 million writers on BART, and only about 2,540 receive these criminal citations. So it's a very targeted impact for very specific writers, right? But when you aggregate the total that it costs that 2,540 writers with those downstream impacts, the estimate is actually $4.2 million to the BART writers, okay? We think that's very important because we don't want to just look at things at face value. We want to think about the negative burdensome consequences that issuing these fines and fees, which ultimately doesn't have a revenue benefit for BART, what does it do for writers as well? Okay, next slide, please. So we conducted a very large scale qualitative interview for qualitative design for this project. For those who are not familiar with qualitative research, of course, you can't say this represents everybody's perspective, right? But what we did is do our best to get what's called a good sample, a representative sample. And we did want to speak primarily to people who are most impacted by criminal citations and by fare enforcement stops on the BART system. And so to that degree, we selected the way we designed where we reached out to people to talk about the impact of fare evasion and the downstream consequences. We went to the 8 BART stations that have the highest activity of fare enforcement in the BART system. And you can see the stations listed on the left side of your screen: El Cerrito, Bayfair, Lake Merritt, Civic Center, Fruitvale, Powell, and West Oakland. We literally stood outside with clipboards and asked people, anybody who would talk to us, have you ever been stopped for fare evasion in the last 5 years? If they said yes to that, and they were also a Bay Area resident, we ended up talking to them and seeing what their experience was, right? We ended up conducting 17 in-depth interviews with people who had been stopped for fare evasion, and often with a lot other also cited and arrested for fare evasion initiated stops. And those interviews informed some of these downstream consequences, but through the testimonies of community members and community writers who were most impacted, okay? We also conducted a huge focus group effort to understand kind of public safety concerns on BART and what community members actually wanted from the BART system. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, next slide. So let's talk about what some of these folks we interviewed in depth who had been stopped for fare evasion in the past 5 years. And what we found amongst these 17 folks is that the majority of them had been stopped multiple times for fare evasion. Now, I want to emphasize that the majority of them were also unhoused or housing insecure. The majority were people of color, right? And so some of them self-selected, right, by essentially once you found one, they would refer their friends who also had been stopped for fare evasion, okay? So I just want to talk about some of these downstream impacts. Out of the 17, 4 had experienced the discretionary warning. This is when BART PD stops you, catches you fare evading, but then basically lets you go. 4 out of the 17 had received a POP citation, right, the civil citation I talked about earlier. and 13 had received a criminal citation, which has much more of those downstream impacts, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But just to illustrate some of the downstream impacts, I talked to one white woman about middle-aged, had a kind of a long history of housing insecurity in her experience. And she talked about receiving multiple POP citations, right? These civil citations. And eventually she couldn't pay them. She couldn't afford to pay them. So they went to collections. And when they went to collections, because she couldn't pay them there either, they essentially lowered her credit score. And when she went to apply for a single room occupancy, low income housing complex in San Francisco, essentially she was deemed ineligible because of her low credit score. And when I talked to her, I said, "Well, were there other things on your credit report that you hadn't paid?" And she said, "Only the POP citations and a student loan." Right. What's important about that is that in many ways she confirmed some of these downstream consequences that Stout built into that $1,600 figure, which is essentially the idea that, right, you're actually still cumulatively kind of paying for by not being able to access housing as a result of these POP citations. Next slide, please. The majority of people, when we ask them, well, why can't you pay the POP citations or the criminal citations? Again, many of them were low income, very housing insecure or homeless, and essentially were simply unable to pay. The largest reason cited for the reason that they didn't pay the citations that they received was that they couldn't afford them, or they had other financial priorities that took much greater precedence, like feeding family, paying for heating and gas bills, and paying for food, right? So that was the primary reason. For example, young Black man, the quote is on your screen there, said, quote, "I never really paid my tickets, but I'm going to tell them that I didn't pay the fare," meaning whoever the inspection officers were. "What do you expect me to do? I'm homeless. Come on now. It's not like I'm smoking on the BART. It's not like I'm doing dope on the BART." And what he was emphasizing is that for him, fare evasion or not paying citations was not significant compared to these other kinds of behaviors on BART, right? And you can see there are other kind of testimonies as to why people didn't pay them, and kind of as a result, basically taking on those downstream burdensome consequences. Next slide, please. And finally, I just want to kind of say that our analysis, and now this is the quantitative analysis, this is not just the people we interviewed. We looked at all people who received a criminal citation in the years that we analyzed, the 2 years that we analyzed. And what we found is that essentially Black writers received fare evasion criminal citations at a higher rate than non-fare evasion criminal citations, right? And you see that in the light blue. They received 49.6% of all criminal citations for fare evasion. This pattern was opposite for white writers. So you can see almost the inverse there. White writers received only 5.5% of fare evasion criminal citations, and the proportions were roughly equal for other groups, but you see that, for example, Latinx folks also received 18%. So a higher percentage of criminal citations went to Black and Latino people than to white writers. Next slide, please. Okay, and so when you bring this up to BART, one of the first things that they're going to say is, well, the reason we issue citations, Paula, is not to recover revenue, but rather to deter people from fare evading and basically stopping that behavior, discouraging fare evasion behavior, right? And this is a legitimate thing to bring up, right? That having the presence of fare inspection officers on the trains may deter riders from, or discourage riders from believing that there's kind of no accountability for paying their fare, right? However, I want to emphasize that in order to make the claim that fare inspection officers' civil citations or BART PDs criminal citations deter fare evasion, BART would need to not only have a very clear deployment strategy where they would say, okay, on these days we're gonna deploy this many officers to these stations so that we can see a kind of deterrence effect, right, as a result of our presence, right? Or they would also essentially need to keep data on how many people essentially were, if there was a difference, for example, when you did that deployment strategy. Currently, BART had neither of those to offer. They're not collecting data that would help us measure deterrence, nor did they provide a clear deterrence strategy that then we could validate with whatever existing data we might have that we could measure against, right? So those are, again, when you hear the argument about deterrence, it's currently an assumption. It's not a data-driven point, okay? Next slide, and I think I'm passing it over.
Yeah, so we're going to shift from fare evasion enforcement as a revenue collection method and now talk about fare evasion enforcement in relation to public safety outcomes. Next slide. So here's a look at the types of data we examined. We looked at the average rides per year, which was 45.6 million riders. Of those, you can see that POP citations averaged 7,396 per year. And for fare evasion criminal citations, they averaged 3,568 per year. These fare evasion criminal citations covered almost 50% of all criminal citations that BART police and the community safety officers are issuing. We also wanted to know how much BART is spending these activities that specifically target fare enforcement. Stout estimated that BART is spending $27.2 million per year for both sworn and non-sworn officers. Next slide. Taking a deeper look at the fare evasion initiated arrests, which means the reason you got stopped by BART PD was because of fare evading. The initial stop is for fare evasion, but the reason you were arrested might be for another reason. During the 2-year period we looked at, there was an average of 198 arrests per year initiated based on fare evasion. This is a 6.6% of total arrests, which is a small amount. These fare evasion stops accounted for only 24.6% of all the time BPD spent on stops in 2022. We found the main type of fare evasion initiated arrests are outstanding warrants, followed by substance related, which is using illegal substances or if you have drug paraphernalia on you. On the graph, you can see in the light blue showing the interactions and stops that were started from fare evasion, while the dark blue is showing the stops that were started from other things, not fare evasion related. But what we didn't get was a substantive correlation among fare evasion initiated arrest and safety related arrests, categorized as violence, property, or weapon related crimes. Relating to this, you may hear from BART PD saying the reason we're policing fare evaders is because they're posing a much more serious public safety risk and threats, but we couldn't find that correlation that supported an assumption in the actual data of what BART does. Next slide. In terms of non-fare evasion arrests, which means the interaction started because of another reason, not fare evasion, we found outstanding warrants, substance-related arrests, and public disorder charges being the main reasons of those non-fare evasion related arrests. This graph shows what the primary activities police are engaging in and what the main types of arrest are. Outstanding warrants really stand out, followed by substance-related and public disorder. This brings a key question. Are outstanding warrants and substance-related issues, both fare evasion and non-fare evasion initiated, the primary safety issues that BPD wants to spend their time on? This is important to ask because let's think of a scenario of someone getting stopped for fare evasion. They're asked to give proof of payment. They're unable to provide it. The police ask for the ID. When they run that ID, that's when they discover they have an outstanding warrant. Also worth noting, an outstanding warrant can range in severity. It can be something minor as you didn't show up for court, so you have a bench warrant for your arrest, or you have something like a felony charge. We weren't able to confirm what types of outstanding warrants that people were being arrested for, but it's important to make this correlation. If BPD is saying we are here to deal with public safety issues, people with outstanding warrants aren't necessarily engaging in any type of threatening or unsafe behavior on BART at the time of their stop. There's a discovery process. BART PD just ran their ID and then they found out they had an outstanding warrant. Another arrest reason is substance-related issues. Again, is this the main public safety issue they want to police? Most people typically think of safety-related issues as violent crimes or property crimes like stealing or carrying a weapon. This is a question we want to put back to BART because of the data showing the primary activities they are actually engaging in. Next slide. This slide shows that BART riders are arrested at the highest rates, whether the stop is for fare evasion or something else. But what stands out is that for Black riders, fare evasion stops lead to arrests even more often than non-fare evasion stops. But that pattern is reversed for white and Latina riders, who are more likely to be arrested for non-fare evasion reasons. This highlights that fare enforcement is disproportionately impacting Black riders, both in citations and in arrests, which carry very serious consequences. Next slide.
All right, so now we wanted to see, relative to arrest, what were some of those consequences that stemmed from that fare evasion stop and ended up right with another kind of outcome. Amongst those 17 in-depth interviews we conducted, again, one had experienced a fare evasion stop and then an actual arrest for fare evasion charge, for a fare evasion misdemeanor charge. So he had fare evaded multiple times, had received criminal citations multiple times, and BART PD at that point decided to actually charge him with a fare evasion misdemeanor charge. 4 were stopped for fare evasion, but were actually arrested for other charges, which means that essentially the fare evasion stop was kind of the initial reason they got stopped, but it didn't end up actually making it into a specific charge, okay? There was one Black woman amongst the participants that we talked to who was associated with somebody who was stopped for fare evasion and got, by association, arrested with him, okay? And then 7 had experienced an actual fare evasion stop followed by an arrest only for an outstanding warrant. In other words, there were no other additional charges as a result of being stopped, right? So it was only because they had an outstanding warrant. And 8 had been detained, arrested, and booked into the jail at some point during the last 5 years, spending time in jail ranging from 14 hours to 50 days, okay? Now, I want to emphasize that I'll tell you one quick story from one young Black man who had been arrested for an outstanding warrant, was stopped for fare evasion, and then was arrested for an outstanding warrant. He actually got booked into the jail, but when he got to the jail, they could not find the warrant that correlated with him. So it ended up actually being an error. But in the meantime, he had to post bail because he couldn't tolerate the conditions inside the jail. He borrowed money from his sister to get bailed, to get a bail bond. His sister then incurred that debt. Later, when he got out, he could not pay her back, and it was impacting her credit score, right? As a result of having incurred that debt and not being able to pay back the bail bondsman. So really important here, even outstanding warrants can have errors, can be administrative errors, etc. But just to kind of, again, illustrate some of the downstream impacts as a result of that outstanding warrant arrest, okay? Several of the participants talked about deteriorating health conditions as a result of those arrests, including as a result of the stop itself, negative impacts on their financial stability, and negative impacts on their perceptions and relationship with law enforcement. Next slide, please. Of the people we interviewed, several of them had cycled in and out of incarceration. So we're talking about systems-involved people who were getting reincarcerated, rebooked, redetained, and often had previous justice system involvement. Okay. Of the 8 participants who had been booked to the jail following a fare evasion stop, essentially who then got arrested, 3 experienced loss of housing, in many instances because they would be in jail, unable to pay the bond to get out, losing their apartment in the process. 1 lost employment, 2 days in jail, couldn't notify his work, as a result lost the job. two had lost property, such as bikes or cars getting impounded on the BART parking lot, and all 7 out of 8 had experienced loss of financial resources as a result of either bail fees, impound fees, or court-related fees, right? And I'll tell you again 2 stories that really stayed with me out of these interviews. There was an elderly Black man, over 55 years old, was unhoused, clearly, had various health conditions and self-declared himself having health conditions. He self-declared that he was recovering from cancer, and he also self-declared that he was getting methadone treatment at the time that the fare evasion stop happened. It was his multiple times of fare evasion, so they charged him with the arrest for a fare evasion misdemeanor charge, booked him to the jail. But the thing that he teared up over when I talked to him, and even as he was recalling the experience, was the loss of his bike. They left the bike at the BART station where they arrested him, and he could not recover that bike. And that bike, for somebody who was unhoused, was really significant for getting around, and was really important to him personally that he couldn't make arrangements to save that bike, right? Which was a big effort to recover it. He also couldn't get the proper treatment, medical treatment that he needed. So he testified to essentially not being able to have the continuation of methadone-assisted treatment once he was booked into the jail, right? And this for essentially a fare evasion misdemeanor charge. Another Asian American man I spoke with was in a wheelchair, clearly disabled, talked about having so many medical conditions that when they took him to actually get booked into the jail refused to book him because they knew that they couldn't provide the medical services that he needed. His situation started as a welfare check. He had fallen asleep on BART, ended up in a fare evasion check, asking for proof of payment. He was unable to provide it. Then it escalated essentially to a search. They found drug paraphernalia on him. He was a substance user, and essentially went through this entire process of trying to get him booked into the jail only to get refused, right? So this is the kind of consequences that we're talking about that result from these fare evasion stops. Next slide, please. Again, just to kind of quantify a little bit some of those negative health physical impacts. Essentially, 29% of our participants reported experiencing a negative physical health impact as a result of that fare enforcement stop, such as injuries sustained during searches or arrests. The same young man who had that, that warrant that they couldn't find once he got into the once he got booked into the jail, talked about essentially having had just shoulder surgery, but during the arrest, they put his arm so hard up on his back, and you can see the quote there. Quote, "Y'all telling me that what I did when I know I didn't do it. Y'all rough handling me, hitting my arms all bent. I had just had surgery on my arm, probably about like 4 months prior to this. I got my eyes popping just thinking about this," right? So he was actually feeling distressed, recalling the experience as he was talking to me. Next slide, please. The mental health toll was also really serious for some of these downstream consequences, particularly those that ended up in arrest. One Black woman, very young, between the ages of 18 to 24, described essentially being stopped for fare evasion, getting booked for charges other than fare evasion. This led to her actually losing her housing. And when she got out, essentially contributed to feelings of worthlessness, deepening depression, and eventually leading to self-harm. Now, we're not saying that obviously the fare evasion stop is solely responsible for that. We're trying to illustrate some of the cumulative downstream consequences that people can incur as they get tracked into the system. Next slide, please. So now I want to kind of get back to those burdensome consequences, but think about it in more aggregate form, and think about what kinds of consequences that produces not just to the riders themselves, which, as we mentioned before, are around 16, Stout estimated to be $1,654 per criminal citation per rider, cumulatively $4.2 million on those 2,500 or so BART riders who get those criminal citations. But let's think about what the deepening vulnerability of those downstream consequences of fair enforcement cause for those riders, which is that essentially they get greater housing instability. They then have to use the social safety net at greater rates. They have to use Medicaid at greater rates. They have to potentially use emergency hospital services. They may need to apply for various public benefits, right? They may incur astronomical healthcare costs as a result. When you think about the downstream consequences of those fare evasion citations, particularly if they end up in arrest and incarceration, Stout estimated that the impact of that fare enforcement, BART's fare enforcement to governmental and social services in the Bay Area are anywhere from $3.2 to $4.8 million. So importantly, we're trying to reveal that what seems like a really banal, low-level issue, offense, actually produces much greater downstream costs to all of us, right, at a community level. Next slide, please. Okay, and then I promise I'm almost done. Finally, back to those focus groups we conducted. Many thanks to the partner organizations that supported us in recruiting participants for these focus groups. We conducted 14 focus groups, 95 participants. We listened very carefully to their public safety concerns on BART and wanted to understand, okay, what are their primary concerns? What makes them potentially not want to ride BART? Or what are they afraid of in terms of safety related issues while they're riding BART? And again, when we ask these questions, we try to be as thoughtful as possible about including people who are typically not included in focus group or survey data. BART collects a lot of rider data on quick surveys, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're sampling the most marginalized or most disproportionately impacted groups. So we oversampled from Black, Latino, Spanish-speaking. We even had a Mandarin-speaking focus group. We tried to do a focus group specifically for youth to see what their experiences are. And of course, the Bay Area being so prominent with universities and colleges, we also had 2 college groups, right? And we ensured that these were residents living in the counties that the BART system serves. And of course that they could provide verbal consent and understand us and so on, okay? So what did we find in these community focus groups? Here are some of the highlights of our findings. Next slide, please. The primary community concerns that emerged out of those people who said, yes, I do have safety concerns on BART. So again, importantly, not everybody had safety concerns on BART. Only 75 out of the 95 people we talked to actually expressed that openly, right? So amongst those who did have safety concerns, the most prominent concern was around unhoused folks and people with severe mental illness or conditions, right? Essentially, the way that people would describe it is, you know, somebody who's clearly has a mental health condition might be shouting out loud on a BART train and they wouldn't know what to do. And they felt unsafe and unsure of how to respond. And that essentially was one of their concerns. The other one, tied to homelessness or being unhoused, was often spoken about as interrelated to things like people who are substance users and might not be well, to the point where you can't tell if they're unconscious or not. People who might have really significant sanitation issues, very powerful odors, you know, urination, things like that, right? So that was where the core concerns laid. Following that, it was what we classified as quality of life issues, but more as nuisances rather than as safety concerns. So I'll distinguish what I mean by that. When we said that quality of life issues were an actual safety concerns, the person had to express This makes me afraid for myself or for other people on the train, right? Like I'm concerned about my safety or the safety of others. People who expressed it as a nuisance, it was more like, this stuff really bothers me, but I don't feel unsafe, okay? So the vast majority of people who brought up quality of life issues brought it up as a nuisance concern. And these included things like yelling on the trains, smoking tobacco or marijuana on trains, loitering inside BART stations, like I said, unbearable body odor, littering, sanitation, the bathrooms not working at BART stations, right? So those were the other big kind of theme. And really, out of those quality of life issues, 21% kind of correlated them to feeling unsafe, right? An example of this would be the lighting inside the BART station is really bad. This makes me afraid because essentially I don't feel like I have good visibility of who's around. That would be an example, right, of a quality of life issue as a safety concern. 32% did have a concern about violent crimes, but here too, we had to get nuanced about the way we coded and analyzed this because the vast majority had not experienced direct violence themselves. So they hadn't actually had direct experience with somebody threatening them or threatening another person. Oftentimes, their concerns for violence centered around if a high profile killing happened on BART, then their concerns about violence on BART would also escalate, right, as a perception. So, for example, many people mentioned Oscar Grant, and other people mentioned Neil Wilson and what was happening around that time, right? 21% mentioned concerns about property crimes on BART and essentially getting their phones stolen or purses stolen and things like that, right? So again, just to quote some of the folks and the nuances that the participants themselves would provide, this Latino woman who is older talked about, quote, you feel insecure because you see young people standing around there, kids, and you're wondering to yourself, are they going to ask me for money? Are they going to attack me? Are they going to maybe hit me? And again, she didn't have direct experience with this kind of threat, but she's perceptually, potentially anticipating this kind of threat. Next slide, please. To dig a little bit deeper into the concerns around violent crime, again, this was only 24 out of the 75 who mentioned public safety concerns. Basically, they focused on things like assault or robbery or sexual assault on BART. Obviously, murder was much less common, but again, around specific high-profile cases. One Asian man mentioned the time during the pandemic when there were deep associations between COVID and China, and then it kind of surged this anti-Asian violence in the Bay Area. And quote, he said, I know during the pandemic it was some violence towards Asian people, so that's another reason why I didn't really want to go on BART, right? Another Native American woman talked about, quote, I've seen a lot of stuff on the BART. I've seen domestic violence. I've seen people get their bags snatched in the train. I've seen some stuff. I've seen people sleeping in the BART, but I don't know. I guess I've never felt personally unsafe. So here she's making a distinction between I've seen this happen, but it doesn't make me feel unsafe. Whereas for other people, if they witnessed that, it did make them feel unsafe and not always wanting to ride BART. Also importantly, there was very few people who had direct experience with violence or with property crime. It was more perceptual, right? And finally, the Black woman, talking about, quote, yeah, I was kind of scared for a minute after a man who killed Nia Wilson. He was sitting behind her on the BART coming from Oakland. After she got killed, I was really scared to be on BART for a long time. Next slide, please. Related to property crimes, as I mentioned, one Latino woman talked about having a rash of people have their cell phones stolen. And so being really aware and needing to be aware of kind of pickpocketing and stealing purses and stuff like this. Next slide, please. So why do we bring you this community focus group data and what the primary concerns were for BART community folks? It was essentially to highlight that BART PDs fair enforcement activities and non-fair enforcement activities, which primarily end up in arrests for outstanding warrants and substance-related issues, were not the primary concerns that community members had. Community members wanted to focus on violent crime, property crimes, homelessness, mental health, and essentially kind of public disorder issues, right? So why we're putting this kind of all together is that if community is primarily concerned with homelessness and mental health conditions or public nuisances, typically most of those issues are better responded by non-police alternative response systems that BART already in many ways has and could expand. So for example, the ambassador program, the crisis intervention program, those kinds of programs could be expanded. People could be paired with services that they need to treat their mental health conditions or to give them services for for being unhoused or sanitation issues, et cetera. But that is not essentially what the primary activities that BART PD is doing, right? And then given that low return on investment for criminal citations from fair evasion or civil citations from fair evasion, what we're putting back to BART as a question is, should they consider non-punitive measures for addressing the actual public safety concerns? Okay. Next slide. All right,
Thank
so
you,
I'll
Paola.
pass it to Paul.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you, everybody. So that was a lot of information, but and Paolo brought us through a lot of the key takeaways that she wanted to highlight. But overall, here's some more key takeaways that we think are really important from this report. Again, I encourage everyone to read it and digest the deck, which we made available. But one of the key areas here is that there's no evidence that citations lead to significant revenue recovery. That was a big finding that we spoke a lot to BART's public statements. Another really important one was related to public safety. There was no link between fair evasion initiated stops, arrests, and serious public safety crimes. And the majority of arrests or fair evasion arrests were for outstanding warrants and substance related charges. So if BART is looking for warrants and for folks who are substance users, then this is a good practice. If they're not, it may need to be reconsidered. BART is not, and another takeaway here is that BART activity is not clearly aligned with the community concerns. The community is not asking for a punitive response to folks who have warrants or folks who are unhoused or who are addicted. They want these issues resolved, but they want them done in a way that is humane and that focuses on care and not on punishment. We can go to the next slide. So here's some recommendations. I'm not going to read all the recommendations, but broadly, the alternative response recommendations are designed to encourage BART to rely on care as opposed to punishment and to be responsive to the needs of the community and the riders, who, again, are communicating that they want a system of care over that system of punishment. And as Paolo mentioned, a lot of these programs already exist and just need to be tweaked or otherwise adjusted to be responsive to the needs of the community that we're seeing on the BART system. We can go to the next slide. Again, I'm not going to read all the recommendations. However, these are some public safety recommendations for BART that we asked them to consider. These are more focused on the public safety ecosystem that includes the police department. And again, we asked them to focus on a system of care over a system of punishment. And we suggest they do this by creating partnerships, by revising and clarifying some of their policies, and by creating a strategy which they can align their operations to. As we highlighted, there's no clear strategy that we could observe, and that's a big problem if they keep moving forward with the operations as they exist today. We can go to the next slide. Another set of recommendations here are focused on the infrastructure. Stephanie and Paolo did a great job highlighting what some of those issues are. But again, broadly, what we're asking them to do is think about this in terms of care. How do we ensure that care is at the center of how they operate on the BART system? This includes, again, existing programs, improving that access, ensuring that folks can really tap into the programs that have been designed to address the needs of folks who are unable to currently pay their full fare. Focusing on the built environment of BART. Everyone feels more safe when the built environment feels safer, when it's lit, when it's clean, et cetera. Those are issues that BART riders uplifted. One of my favorites here is a focus on an advisory board, which can pull apart these really complicated issues, which are, of course, present in society and therefore present on BART. CP's recommendations, while they're meant to be actionable, and we believe are actionable, do require folks who are closest to the problem community members on BART and BART leadership itself to really work together to address these issues. And the only way that can really happen is if there's a collaborative effort and a group that's focused on doing that together. And finally, I think what's really important here is that BART should acknowledge and retract previous statements that were based on unsubstantiated data. It's really important to have some truth telling in any setting, and this is also true with BART. So without suggesting these are purposefully untrue statements, what we've uncovered is that they are not true, and they should be acknowledged as such by BART. But we thank everybody for coming to today's presentation. We can go to the next slide. Finally, the data collection recommendations, right? CP is a data-driven organization, and we believe BART and all other organizations should really focus on on ensuring that their data is available and can guide their operations. Without data that drives decision-making, we are left to what may currently exist, which is policies and practice based on assumptions and best guesses, which can impact community members negatively. We can go to the next slide.
Okay. Thank you so much, Hans. Thank you, rest of the team. That was wonderful. We'll pause now and move to some Q&A to see if any of our participants here have any questions they'd like to pose to the team now. We do have a few in the queue we can start with, but please feel free to use that Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to let us know if you have any additional questions. So we have one question here, Paula, that I think maybe you'll be able to speak to really well. Why did CP oversample Black and unhoused people in the one-on-one interviews? And would people stop for fare evasion? And how does this impact findings? I know you have a lot of wisdom to offer on that topic.
Awesome. Thanks, Price. Yeah. So I'll just say that we did a very extensive literature review, background research review before we started designing this project, just to see how many studies had been done with the most impacted people, the people most impacted by fare evasion enforcement practices. And while there were other qualitative studies on, what happens to people when they get stopped and frisked or, various types of police stops, there were no qualitative studies that we could find that really focused on the voices of the most impacted folks, particularly in public transit systems, right? Or specifically related to fare evasion. So one of the reasons we oversample Black, Latino, Asian, Native folks and low-income folks or unhoused folks is because those are the people most likely to be impacted by fare enforcement. And while, of course, in a public transit system, it's really important to get everybody's perspective because everybody's a rider and it's a public transit system that belongs to everyone. It's really important that those downstream consequences that we've tried to give a lot of examples of, both financially and personally and governmentally and in terms of the broader community impact, do not fall equally on everyone, right? The vast majority of people, when we stood outside those BART stations where there was a lot of fare enforcement activity, we tried to talk to everyone, no matter what they looked like and who they were, right? But we kept finding that the people who had been stopped for fare evasion were consistently either low income, unhoused, Black, or brown. And so that led us, right? We believe that those who are most impacted and essentially experience the downstream consequences of these policing practices are also closest to the solutions. What are the things that would actually remedy some of the problems? And we also believe that those who are typically not sampled, typically not consulted, their testimonies and stories are not part of what informs data-driven recommendations or reports like this one. In this instance, it was really important to our mission and to our project to essentially use the quantitative data we already had from the 2020 report, which showed Black folks are, experiencing police stops in the BART police system very disproportionately. So that's just police stops overall, but specifically fare enforcement. We wanted to get their perspectives first and foremost.
Thank you so much for that, Paula. We have another question here in a similar vein, if you don't mind me putting you back on the spot. Why did you conduct one-on-one interviews with only 17 individuals? Would you like to speak to that?
Sure. And, you know, for those who might not be familiar with this type of research, right? 17 is a pretty good number. Like, I know it doesn't sound like a lot relative to all the writers, but you want to kind of interview enough people that the same themes keep coming up. And when you see that the same themes keep coming up, then you realize, okay, even if I talk to 20 or 30 other people, we're likely to hear the same thing, right? Some of that was influenced by resource constraints, right? So CPE is a national organization. We traveled to the Bay Area for a week. We were out there every single day, 5 days a week at all those different BART stations. And a lot of why we ended up with 17 interviews is who met our criteria, had actually been stopped for fare evasion in the last 5 years, who was willing to talk to us and had the time to talk to us. And importantly, we found a lot more people who took our short survey. 58 people took our short kind of 5-minute survey where we kind of polled them on had they been cited, what was the downstream impacts of being cited, and so on. And we used that data as well. But the one-on-one interviews is where we got these really rich, in-depth stories. Could we have done more? Of course. With qualitative research, you could always do more. But again, a lot of it in research is resource constraints and time and place and what kind of people are willing to talk to you at that time.
Thank you so much, Paula. Oh, and thank you. Now we can see each other. So we have another question here that says, what are the first steps BART or the community would need to take to implement some of these changes? So Hans and Paula, Steph, please feel free to chime in, but I think I would start this question by saying, obviously with the positional authority that BART and the BART board are in, I would say the majority of the onus is on them currently. Hans touched on this earlier, but I think it's important to reiterate that CPE produces reports which are intended to be actionable. Our recommendations are not intended to be pie in the sky, unreachable goals. They're intended to be things that could really be implemented in a realistic way. And that also is something that we can support with. So we always offer our ability to uphold those activities, support in any way when it comes to implementing potential recommendations. So I would say BART and the BART board have an opportunity to engage in a serious way with this report and with its recommendations, to discuss certain ones, to discuss their feasibility, discuss the budgetary constraints and concerns, and really take a good look at their operations and make changes based upon these findings and these recommendations. But separately, I think the community has a kind of different role in this work. And first and foremost, I would say just generally seeking accountability from BART as a provider of a service that so many folks within this community use, attending public comment, reaching out to the folks on the board, reaching out to your representatives, seeking those working in the nonprofit spaces that are seeking more equity in the transit space within the Bay Area. There's so much rich work already happening. And if anyone has questions or would like to be connected with any of the connections we were able to make over the course of this project, please do reach out. Our emails were on the screen and should still be available to you following this webinar. We'd love to have more conversations about how we could recommend folks getting more involved. But even so, that's really just sort of a cursory start. But we definitely want to see the community and the agency interact with these findings and empower themselves to, sort of make the changes they want to see. But Hans and Paula, Steph, please chime in if there's anything you'd like to add to that question. Great, awesome. Okay, well, in our final minutes here, I'll just remind all of our participants that you can continue to submit questions if you have any before we close out. We have a question here. Are the alternative response programs currently funded through BART PD specifically, or a part of the overall BART budget? That's a good question. Paula, please feel free to jump in since you're our financial translator, at least today, during today's presentation.
Yeah, Hans was also going to chime in, but yes, they are part of the overall budget and they are essentially structured within the BART Police department. So one of our recommendations is to actually dissociate the two, the non-police response, alternative response, away from the enforcement dimension of BART. And the reason we recommend that has to do with a lot of research that we do on alternative response systems all over the nation, which suggests that when you house non-police response systems under an enforcement structure, it tends to default to enforcement from the perception of the public. And conversely, when you situate it outside of that as an independent kind of arm that's not governed by the police department, even though there are many structures for collaboration and you could always call the police if you need backup and things like that, but those non-police alternative response systems that are more focused on a kind of public health approach, one situated in a kind of wellness approach, pairing with services, working with community organizations that are very resource rich in the Bay Area to actually connect people to services and not simply remove them from the system. Typically that works better, particularly from the perspective of systems impacted people, because they're not seeing, for example, the ambassadors or the crisis intervention technician as an extension of the police. They're seeing them as somebody who cares about them, whose primary task is not to penalize and punish them.
Well said, Paula. Okay. Final call for any questions. And if anyone has any questions that they don't have the chance to ask here or would like to sort of talk about offline, again, our inboxes are open to you all. We'd love to stay in touch and follow up on any potential questions or next steps from this report. Okay, well, seeing no extra questions, I will recap sort of the housekeeping here. All attendees will receive a follow-up email that will include the recording of the presentation, the slides themselves. We encourage everyone to read the report, read the brief. They're available on our website. And there is a survey that you will pop up when you close this webinar if you'd like to participate in that. And thank you all so much. Thank you for your time and participation today. We really appreciate it.